Hi everybody, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I want to get into talking about a few decks in my collection that I feel are underrated. So I think they're really great and wonderful and decks that stand out in some way, shape, or form, but that for some reason I always forget about and don't use nearly as much as I feel I probably should. So I've chosen 5 today that I want to speak about, explain why it is that they are so great, and also why I think that they might be underrated, at least in my collection personally. So I mentioned in my recent video about my favorite pip decks that I was reorganizing my decks, trying to put them in categories, and I also mentioned that I thought that the Marigold Tarot for me was an underrated deck, and that got me thinking about other decks that I was pulling out and acknowledging that I hadn't used in maybe a few months or so, or even touched or thought of them. So we're going to get right into this. We're going to start with the Indigo Alchemist Tarot. This is one that I got on Etsy, and I believe that's where it's sold. And this deck is really unique. So it comes with this nice bag with this, I believe it's glue. No, it's stitched on. It's a stitched on sort of logo. And you get a little crystal that comes with it. I believe that this is a slip on the crystal. It says, your guardian black tourmaline stone has been soaked in a salt bath and charged under a strawberry moon. So a charged crystal comes with the deck, which was really cool and nice. And this is by Heather Blumenthal. I believe you can see that there. If you search this deck, it'll come up through Google, and if you're on Etsy specifically, it should come up. I believe it's still in print. And so we get a little title card. It says, the Indigo Alchemist Tarot, when the stars have collided, the sun has grown cold. Although happiness evades and your world is amiss, your inner alchemist will transform your darkness to gold, illuminating the shadow, leading you out of the abyss. And then it has her contact info. And these are the backs as well for all of the cards. Very pretty. And this little white book, I won't get too much into it, but it's pretty helpful. It gives you a nice little rundown. There are some astrological aspects included for consideration, which is nice for anybody interested in those things. And you get a nice little synopsis. So nothing outrageous, but it is nice. It's nice to have. And I will say that the cardstock on this deck is a little bit of a detractor for me and potentially a reason why it's underrated. It's extremely thin to the point where it just feels like very lightly laminated printer paper. I know that's not actually what it is, but the cardstock is just so thin that I always fear I'm going to ruin it or bend it beyond repair when I'm shuffling or using it, and that's kind of unfortunate. And so it doesn't really seem like the kind of deck that would hold up very well for that reason of the cardstock, which is unfortunate. Although I will say there are worse things in the world, and the artwork is really stunning, which is, I think, what stands out and what kind of really matters at its core. But at the end of the day, if something gets in the way of you working with the deck, it just does. It's hard to convince yourself that that doesn't matter when it does to you. So here are a few of the cards. The Judgment card. The art style on this is extremely interesting. I would say that while the meanings primarily relate to Rider-Waite-Smith, the imagery is not at all indicative of those traditional depictions. I would say that the core meaning clearly is that there's some sort of oppressive force pushing her down, but then we get something more cosmic going on, a hand to catch her. There is an element of this deck that's extremely cosmic in nature. The colors are vibrant. It's very playful as well. It's just a very, very unique and interesting deck. So whenever I do break it out like what I'm doing right now, I always am tempted to work with it and start to try to work with it, but for some reason it tends to fade to the background for me. And I do think that part of it has to do with the cardstock, unfortunately. And while so many of these images are so unique and wonderful, there are some that I don't jive so well with. For example, this Hierophant, while unique and interesting, it doesn't really do it for me. Some of the fact that the cards are so symbolic in that there's just this helmet, there's just these spears going on. There's so much going on, and there's a bit of a disconnect with the cards that are more scenic and involve people and those that are more simplistic, if that makes sense. And so that sort of detachment is difficult for me to reconcile. I will say I love the pages. All of the pages are these sort of like very Middle Ages, Dark Ages declarations written on a scroll or like a scribe, just as we might think of a page as sort of that deliverer of messages or a scribe of sorts. So this is the Page of Wands, and it says, hear ye, all princes and princesses, you are formally invited to your passion to discover a new phase in your life. And it's of course burned because wands and fire, and we get the little fire symbol down here. So I find that to be really, really fun and interesting. Some of these have a lot of alchemical and esoteric aspects going on, which I love. And there's just a lot here to dig into. So a very unique and awesome deck. It does tend to be forgotten by me just because of this sort of disconnect between certain imagery in the deck and some of the images that don't really work so well for me. Likewise, the card stock is just so thin that I do get worried about damaging the deck irreversibly, and it doesn't really wear so well. And I guess that just plays into that sort of tactile experience that so many people talk about. And so next we will get into the SAKKI-SAKKI Tarot. So the SAKKI-SAKKI Tarot is by Monicka, Clio, SAKKI. This deck has been out for a while. I know it's sort of this limited print run sort of situation, so I'm not 100% sure that it's in stock. I believe you can get it on Etsy, and there are a few other third-party sites that I know sell it, or distributors of the deck. It comes with a really nice, pretty chunky guidebook, and this deck is geared towards artists and creativity, so it is relatively, in its imagery, a clone of the Rider-Waite-Smith, but it's so colorful and playful and bright and vibrant that you really do get a sense that it's meant for artists and creative endeavors. And so that's a really unique aspect to it. There is a book that comes separately, a full-size guidebook that comes separately that you can buy. And so these are the backs. Super bright neon yellow. These really interesting flowers. I actually really like them. I can see how this would be a love-hate situation for some. The deck is on the smaller side. It's about the same height as a traditional tarot card, but it's a lot narrower. And so this is the general art style. It reminds me of some cartoon shows from the early 2000s. While I would say it's, oh, and there are a bunch of figures that don't have heads in the deck. That's just one of the little quirks to it, and I actually really find that endearing and funny. It's very random and sporadic, and there's no rhyme or reason necessarily to it, at least that I know of. So the imagery mirrors the Rider-Waite-Smith pretty closely, and that can be nice for beginners. That's also nice for people who just want to get back to the basics, but also want something a bit different. I think for me, it's one that often gets forgotten because there are so many Rider-Waite-Smith clones and derivatives, and in recent months I have not been working so much with the Rider-Waite-Smith system, so most decks that contain this sort of imagery have been on the back burner for me, so I guess that plays a decent role. But it's so fun and different and quirky and unique, and there is this extra card, the artist, and it's just an empty stage, and I think that's just so cool. This is a card that I actually keep in the deck, whereas some extra cards I can't work with or don't really have a connection to. This one I do, so I wouldn't necessarily say I'm an artist, but I guess in some regards I am. So I enjoy this card for what it has to offer. So yeah, just a really fun, quirky deck. I think that it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite Rider-Waite-Smith clones being used loosely, but that maybe I just haven't used it because I haven't been working with the Rider-Waite-Smith so much recently. We'll get into this bag, which contains the Spolia Tarot. I know that this was a big one for some people, or is a big one for some people, and it definitely had a sort of hype period a few years back. it comes with these extra cards, which I keep separate. I forget what that type of deck is called that has all of the zodiac signs and the elements. There is a name for those decks, and for those who know it, who are probably screaming at the camera, I'm sorry. So we get the elements. This is a photo collage deck. So very real, actual photographs collaged, I believe digitally collaged. So we get the elements, and then we get the zodiac. And so those are really nice to have and interesting. It's a nice add-on when a deck does this. These cards, I will say, the card stock is very thick, like very thick. This is just the 78, and it's one of the chunkiest decks that I have. And it's also very cardboardy, so it's not very bendable. This is not a deck that you can riffle, shuffle, or bridge. It's the kind that'll probably actually get creases and bends very easily if you aren't careful. So definitely recommend overhand shuffling. These are the backs, this sort of purple and deep hued with the slashes. I actually really like these backs. And for me, I think that I have trouble with photo collage decks. And while this one is absolutely stunning, I think it's just a certain mood I have to be in, which is why it's underrated. So I don't feel very drawn to use this. And part of it, I think, is because of that photography and that collaging. I look for more painted, drawn, different types of mediums to be used than collage in a lot of the decks that I frequently use. So it's just an art style preference, but I don't think I would ever get rid of this deck. It is absolutely stunning. And there are times that I will get really, really potent and wonderful messages from this deck, but I do have to be in the mood for it, and sometimes I will go many months without being in the mood for it. So this is the Spolia Tarot. It's wonderful, and it's underrated for me. Like, see how thick this deck is trying to get it, and this is a pretty large bag. I just try to keep the extra set of cards separate. All right, so now we will go right along into the Watersprite Tarot by Muir McDonald. So there, if you Google this, you will probably get her website, which is where I believe you can primarily purchase this deck, from her website. I believe she's an Australian deck creator. She signs the decks, comes in this nice hard box, although the box is a lot bigger than the deck, so I put the deck in a bag within the box. This deck was actually a primary inspiration for this video. When I was moving this deck, I decided to flip through the cards, and I was so curious as to why I wasn't using this deck, because I do love it so much. And I think the biggest reason for me has to be the size and the way that the cards slide, so the sort of texture to the cards. So these are the backs. Has very rounded corners, which I actually really like, but they're so big that I can't really riffle shuffle this very easily, and they have that sort of glossy stickiness to them that means that they kind of like clump, and it doesn't necessarily even overhand shuffle all that well, which is unfortunate. Now, part of this is my fault because this deck does come in two sizes, and this is the larger size. So I forget how the sizes are categorized. They have different titles, but in my head I thought, oh, a larger deck, larger artwork, that'll be better for me. But I think I would have been better suited to the small one, and I might be using it a lot more. So my biggest hang up, and I think why it's underrated for me, has to do with the size. And if you think that's going to be a hang up for you, there is a smaller size option. And the card stock and the way they sort of slide against each other with that glossiness that can clump. So that's just, I guess, part of that tactile experience, again, that keeps me from using it. So this follows the Rider-Waite-Smith relatively closely. There is a really awesome guidebook which is sold separately that I do have. And this deck involves a lot of Jungian psychology. So there is this big emphasis on the unconscious, the subconscious, the collective unconscious. So psychological aspects play a big role here. There's this sort of mystic, spiritualized psychology to it, which I think is part of Jung's whole spiel, especially in his later works. You'll see a lot of that mysticism and spirituality sort of permeate his writings. And so it's really interesting in that regard. So if you like Jung, if you like this art style and this imagery, I highly recommend it. There are some cards that deviate from the Rider-Waite-Smith in a way that's stunning. This Seven of Pentacles to me, with that vast scenery, is amazing. The Seven of Swords. There are some cards that are just breathtaking, and then others for me that just kind of fall flat. This Ace of Pentacles is nice. It's just nice. Same for most of the aces in this deck. Cards like this are just kind of meh for me. What I really like are cards like, let me see if I can find some. This Eight of Wands, that very Sagittarian aspect, hovering over the earth to fire an arrow. This Two of Swords, and there's no swords present, so it really is just her, and that really has gotten me thinking. There's this extra card, that's what I was looking for. So we get the blank card, and it just has our solar system, or at least it appears from the Earth back, so we don't really get Mercury and Venus, and we don't see the sun, but that's really a cool card to interact with as well, I've found. I'm seeing if there's any really... The Seven of Cups is really cool. So yeah, there are some cards in this deck that blow me away, and others that really don't. The Five of Cups, amazing. Four of Cups, I think has to be my favorite Four of Cups out there. So it's mostly underrated just for that cardstock and size element. I'm considering trimming it, so if I trim it, I will get back to you guys and let you know how that affects me working with it. But it's a wonderful, wonderful deck. I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in Young and this artwork. And so the final deck that we have... Sorry, just trying to clean up so that I don't have a mess for myself at the end. But the final deck that we have here is... This is one that I'm not sure if you can get, to be honest. It's I believe it's called the Harry Potter Tarot. Is there a title card? This card just has two backs. Okay, the Harry Potter Tarot, and it's signed. It's by Eleonore Pieper. She makes the New Era Elements Tarot as well, which I know is a deck that is mass market, and I think it's produced by US Game Systems. Now this is not produced at all by mass market or privately for the most part. There's not like an Etsy page where you can buy this, but you can reach out to Eleonore Pieper. I forget how I got in contact with her. I think I just Googled her and found her on one of her one website where she has an account as an artist, and reached out. And the reason I reached out is because I saw Lisa from Supportive Tarot talk about this deck and how she went about acquiring it. So basically you reach out to Eleonore Pieper, and I don't want to say that it's something that's still going on, but at least in the past you could pay her and have her send you a copy of this deck, and she has a few copies, or she does it basically by demand in the way that she gets them printed. So these are the backs, and they all pertain to Harry Potter. So I really like her take on Harry Potter. I know in recent days I'm not as big a fan of J.K. Rowling, and it's kind of tainted my childhood memories of Harry Potter. But I see this as a personal derivative and an interpretation, so I think I can continue to work with this. It does follow the Thoth system. There are keywords for the minors. Some of the keywords are the same as the Thoth deck, and some of them aren't. And there's a lot of detail in these cards. They are true to the books more so than they are the movies, as far as I've found. The illustrations are stunning. The illustrative style is similar to that of the New Era Elements Tarot, if you're familiar with that one. And for me, this just feels like a nostalgic hug of a sort. It has that Thothy element, and because I've been working with the Thoth, I guess I really should try to get back into this. I think my hang-up is just that this deck feels so specific that it's hard to reach for it. This is something that isn't an all-purpose deck. It's really a bit of a novelty deck in some regards, and the keywords being a little bit different from the Thoth is, I think if it was more true to the Thoth in its imagery and depiction and the keywords, I might be more tempted to pull it out. All in all, it's a stunning deck. The cardstock is good. The imagery is very, very interesting. So if you are somebody who has that sort of nostalgic childhood Harry Potter thing going on like I do, then this might be one for you, and you might want to consider reaching out to Eleonore Pieper. I believe she has an Etsy shop, which is how I think that's how I got in contact with her. I could be wrong. But perhaps she's still selling these, I'm not sure. And that brings us to my final of the 5 underrated decks in my collection. So these are all decks that I love and wish I was using a bit more, but I'm not. And now you know why. So if this was interesting or entertaining for you, feel free to like and subscribe. I'd love to know what sorts of underrated decks you have in your collection that you want to work with more, but maybe don't, or should bring off the shelves more frequently. So let me know about that in the comments. I hope you are all well. Until next time, bye everyone.